Look into this animation entitled The Holographic Cosmogram, taking into account its mutual co-definition and that the spiral emerges from and returns to 4. Then use your comprehension of its meaning and embedded ethics to evaluate the political paradigm of Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel, encoded in their expressions of how society should function. Then explain if they are in alignment with the Cosmogram's ethics and how they are attempting to implement their vision through political action. The Holographic Cosmogram and the Political Paradigms of Yarvin and Thiel, a study in cosmic ethics and corporate sovereignty. Understanding the Holographic Cosmogram. The Holographic Cosmogram presents a profound spiritual and philosophical framework that embodies the interconnectedness of all existence through sacred geometric principles. At its core, the Cosmogram illustrates the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity, with a spiral pattern emerging from and returning to the number 4, representing stability, balance, and the 4 foundational elements of existence. The spiral itself symbolizes the evolutionary journey of consciousness, growth, and the cyclical nature of universal processes. The Cosmogram structure reveals multiple layers of meaning through its geometric relationships. The number 4 serves as the foundation point, representing earth, air, fire, and water, the cardinal directions, and the material stability necessary for spiritual evolution. From this stable foundation, the spiral emerges, carrying the principle of dynamic growth while maintaining connection to its source. This reflects the holographic principle that each part contains the whole, suggesting that individual consciousness is both distinct and inseparable from universal consciousness. Embedded ethics of the Cosmogram. The ethical framework embedded within the holographic cosmogram emphasizes several key principles that contrast sharply with hierarchical power structures. The cosmogram embodies values of communalism, respect for elders and ancestors, harmony with nature, and the integration of spirituality into daily life. It presents a holistic view of existence where being is dynamic, relational, and interconnected, challenging compartmentalized Western notions of existence by highlighting the fluidity and multiplicity of realities. The spiral's movement from and return to 4 suggests an ethical imperative toward balance, cyclical renewal, and the recognition that all growth must remain grounded in fundamental stability. This cosmic pattern implies that healthy development involves both expansion and return, innovation and tradition, individual expression and collective harmony. The political vision of Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin, writing under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, has developed a comprehensive critique of democratic governance that he terms neo-reaction or the Dark Enlightenment. His political philosophy centers on the replacement of democratic systems with what he calls Neocameralism, a form of governance modeled after joint stock corporations where power is concentrated in a CEO-monarch figure. The Cathedral and Democratic Critique. Yarvin's central concept is the cathedral, which he describes as a network of academia, media, bureaucracy, and activist organizations that collectively shape public opinion and policy. 10. He argues that these institutions operate independently of voter control, perpetuating progressive orthodoxy through mutual reinforcement, making democratic processes essentially meaningless. His proposed solution involves the complete dismantling of existing democratic institutions and their replacement with sovereign corporations, or Guillaume. In this system, residents don't like their government, they can and should move. The design is all exit, no voice. This represents a fundamental rejection of democratic participation in favor of consumer-style choice among competing governance providers. Neocameralist governance model. Yarvin's Neocameralist vision proposes that a sovereign state or primary corporation is not organizationally distinct from a secondary or private corporation. The sovereign power would be held by large shareholders who elect an executive with total power, similar to how corporate boards function. This CEO monarch would have absolute control, similar to the authority exercised by a CEO in a private company, while being accountable only to major stakeholders rather than the general population. Peter Thiel's technological libertarianism. Peter Thiel's political philosophy represents a sophisticated form of technological libertarianism that explicitly rejects democratic governance. In his influential 2009 essay The Education of a Libertarian, Thiel declared that he no longer believed that freedom and democracy are compatible. His reasoning centers on the belief that democratic constituencies, particularly welfare beneficiaries and women, make libertarian politics electorally impossible. The Sovereign Individual Framework. Thiel has been profoundly influenced by The Sovereign Individual, a book he described as having shaped his thinking before founding PayPal. This work envisions a future where nation-states will decline and smaller, corporate-governed entities that treat people as consumers rather than citizens will rise to take their place. Thiel's vision involves creating new spaces for personal freedom that governments could not reach, spheres where the choices of one great man could still be paramount. Exit architectures and technological implementation. Rather than working within democratic systems, Thiel advocates for escape from politics in all its forms through technological means. His approach involves three primary exit architectures: cyberspace through companies like Palantir, space colonization, and seasteading, the creation of floating cities beyond national jurisdiction. 21. These projects aim to create governance structures that operate outside traditional democratic oversight. 1261. Implementation strategies and political action. Urbit, digital feudalism in practice. Yarvin's most concrete implementation of his political vision is Urbit, a decentralized computing platform that embodies neo-reactionary principles in its very architecture. 128-129. The platform creates a hierarchical digital space divided into galaxies, stars, and planets, where political power that one wields in the Urbit system depends on how much address space an individual owns. Originally, these were explicitly called lords, dukes, and earls, revealing the feudal nature of the system. 301. Urbit represents what researchers describe as digital feudalism, where sovereignty is coded into Urbit space through cryptographic property ownership. The system offers only exit as a form of political agency, meaning users can only move between different hierarchical structures rather than participate in democratic governance. Seasteading and Techno-Colonialism. The Seasteading Institute, CO, founded by Thiel and Patry Friedman in 2008, represents a direct attempt to implement exit-based governance. These floating cities are designed to operate as modular structures that can be arranged into atolls and archipelagos with dynamic character, allowing units to move between different governance systems. Scholars have characterized this movement as techno-colonialism, arguing that it represents an attempt to selectively reproduce settler colonial practices adjusted to 21st century realities. The Seasteading Project explicitly aims to create new territories where traditional democratic oversight cannot reach, allowing for experimental governance models based on corporate rather than democratic principles. Contemporary political influence. Both Yarvin and Thiel have gained significant influence within current political movements. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has explicitly endorsed Yarvin's ideas about purging government institutions. 12. While prominent Silicon Valley figures like Mark Andreessen have praised Yarvin's anti-democratic ideology, Thiel's company Palantir has been enlisted to build the most expansive surveillance infrastructure in U.S. history. 32, representing a concrete implementation of technological control systems. The Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, headed by Elon Musk, has been described as systematically implementing Yarvin's vision by seizing control of government infrastructure and installing loyalists into agencies. This represents what critics describe as the systematic dismantling of American governance through the replacement of democratic institutions with corporate-style management, fundamental misalignment with Cosmogram ethics. The political paradigms of Yarvin and Thiel stand in profound opposition to the ethical principles embedded in the holographic Cosmogram, where the Cosmogram emphasizes interconnectedness, balance, and cyclical renewal. Their systems prioritize hierarchy, exit, and linear accumulation of power. Rejection of universal interconnectedness. The Cosmogram's holographic principle suggests that each part contains the whole and that individual consciousness exists within universal consciousness. This implies ethical obligations toward collective well-being and mutual responsibility. In contrast, Yarvin and Thiel's systems explicitly reject collective democratic participation in favor of individual sovereignty exercised through market-based exit mechanisms. Their vision of governance through GovCore treats citizens as consumers, rather than interconnected beings with mutual obligations. This fundamentally contradicts the Cosmogram's emphasis on communalism, respect for elders and ancestors, harmony with nature, and the integration of spirituality into daily life. Violation of balance and cyclical principles. The Cosmogram's spiral pattern, emerging from and returning to the foundational number 4, suggests that healthy development requires both expansion and return to stable foundations 3. Yarvin and Thiel's political models, however, are based on linear accumulation of power and permanent exit from collective responsibility. Their systems create permanent hierarchies where political power depends on how much address space an individual owns or how much capital one can deploy for exit strategies. This violates the Cosmogram's principle of cyclical renewal and the return to foundational balance, instead creating self-reinforcing cycles of inequality and separation. Instrumentalization of technology. While the Cosmogram suggests that technological and spiritual development should serve collective flourishing and cosmic harmony, Yarvin and Thiel employ technology primarily as a means of escaping collective obligations. Their use of platforms like Urbit and Palantir represents what scholars describe as architectures of exit designed to avoid, rather than enhance democratic participation. The Cosmogram's holographic principle implies that technological development should reflect and enhance universal interconnectedness. Instead, their technological implementations create new forms of digital feudalism and surveillance systems that concentrate rather than distribute power. Conclusion. The holographic Cosmogram presents a vision of existence grounded in universal interconnectedness, cyclical balance, and the integration of individual growth with collective harmony. The political paradigms of Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel represent a fundamental rejection of these principles, instead advocating for hierarchical systems based on exit, accumulation, and the avoidance of democratic participation. Their implementation strategies, from Urbit's digital feudalism to Seasteading's techno-colonialism to the current dismantling of government institutions, demonstrate a systematic attempt to create governance structures that prioritize individual sovereignty over collective responsibility. This stands in direct opposition to the Cosmogram's emphasis on mutual co-definition, where individual and universal consciousness exist in dynamic, interconnected relationship. The spiral's movement from and return to 4 suggests that authentic development requires both innovation and grounding, expansion and integration. Yarvin and Thiel's vision offers only expansion and exit, rejecting the cyclical return that would reintegrate individual development with collective wisdom. Their political project thus represents not cosmic evolution, but a form of spiritual and social fragmentation that contradicts the holographic principle of universal interconnectedness that the Cosmogram embodies. What the hell is wrong with these men? What do they want that they can't get from treating everyone as siblings who are equal instead of children to be ruled over like an abusive parent? The psychology behind power and control, understanding what drives authoritarian personalities. Your question cuts to the heart of a profound psychological puzzle that has fascinated researchers for decades. The desire to dominate rather than collaborate reveals deep-seated psychological wounds and defensive mechanisms that stem from fundamental fears and unresolved trauma. The wounded core, narcissistic injury and shame. At the foundation of authoritarian personalities lies what psychologists call narcissistic injury, profound feelings of humiliation, shame, or inadequacy that trigger defensive mechanisms like rage, violence, and vindictiveness. These individuals often have especially fragile self-images that are threatened easily and frequently. The need to control others serves as a protective fortress they've built around themselves to cope with deep vulnerabilities. Research reveals that narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by an inflated self-importance, eagerness for admiration, and lack of compassion. However, beneath this grandiose exterior lies a fragile core self-image. Individuals with these traits often feel superior to and report that they despise others, though their fundamental self-perception is one of fragility, childhood trauma, and the development of control patterns. The roots of authoritarian behavior frequently trace back to adverse childhood experiences. Studies show that childhood traumas can play an important role in the development of narcissistic personality structure, often caused by traumatic experiences in early life. Children who grow up in narcissistic families are assigned roles to control them according to the interests of narcissistic subjects, commonly experiencing abuse and violence, while others receive preferential treatment. Authoritarian parenting has been found to lead to feelings of increased responsibility among children due to always trying to please their parents. This parenting style is negatively related to self-esteem and positively correlated with insecurity and inferiority. Research demonstrates that childhood trauma was significantly greater in individuals with authoritarian parents than those with authoritative parents. The fear-power dynamic. When fear is present, individuals naturally desire to control outcomes by taking on bully, victim, or savior roles that externalize their fear and separate them from their truth. Power dynamics with authority can create feelings of vulnerability and helplessness, where this imbalance of power can evoke feelings of powerlessness and trigger intense fear responses. The authoritarian personality theory suggests that certain individuals possess psychological traits that predispose them to favor strong authority figures and rigid social structures. These personalities often create hierarchies wherein they and those like them are at the top, while anyone who disagrees with their way of life is at the bottom. They may believe they deserve obedience from people they consider beneath them. What they actually want, security through dominance. Individuals with dark triad personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy are more likely than others to aim for and achieve power. These traits are associated with a callous, manipulative, interpersonal style and statistically increase a person's likelihood to commit crimes, cause social distress, and create severe problems for organizations, especially in leadership positions. The fundamental drive isn't about genuine leadership or creating better outcomes for society. Instead, it's about control as defense against vulnerability. Narcissistic individuals experience threats to their grandiose, superior, and entitled self-image, leading to what's called narcissistic injury. Control over others serves as a survival mechanism, a way to avoid feeling the powerlessness they experienced in childhood. Avoidance of authentic relationship. Research shows that narcissistic pathology includes interpersonal enhancement, avoidance, aggressivity, and control, which contributes to challenges in forming genuine therapeutic alliances and relationships. They embrace roles like omnipotent caregiver, which comes with boredom, anger, and lack of satisfaction in social life, fear of being ordinary or equal. The authoritarian mindset reflects a deep rejection of equality because it threatens their defensive structure. As one study notes, individuals with narcissistic traits often feel entitled to unconditional positive regard, admiration, and attention from others. Treating others as equals would mean acknowledging their own fundamental humanity and vulnerability. Why sibling-like equality feels threatening. Your suggestion of treating everyone as siblings who are equal actually represents everything that authoritarian personalities fear most. Research on sibling relationships shows they provide important contexts for the development of children's understanding of their social, emotional, moral, and cognitive worlds. Siblings learn to manage disagreements, regulate emotions in socially acceptable ways, and develop empathy through daily interactions. However, for individuals with authoritarian tendencies, such equality threatens their defensive structure because it requires vulnerability. Healthy sibling relationships involve mutual support, shared power, and emotional openness. It demands empathy. Equal relationships require genuine concern for others' welfare rather than using them for narcissistic supply. It challenges grandiosity. Sibling-like equality means accepting that one is not inherently superior to others. The developmental alternative they missed. Research demonstrates that warm, close bonds with siblings in early adult life predict greater resilience later in life, with less loneliness and better mental health outcomes. Children who experience authoritative rather than authoritarian parenting develop better emotional regulation skills and learn necessary skills to alleviate problems. Studies show that egalitarian relationships are characterized by partners being emotionally present for each other, attuned to each other's needs, and able to have their wishes and concerns heard equally. This represents the collaborative, supportive dynamic that authoritarian personalities struggle to achieve. The tragic irony. The most tragic aspect is that what these individuals desperately seek, security, respect, and significance, could actually be achieved through the collaborative, egalitarian approach you suggest. Research shows that collaborative leadership can enhance emotional regulation, positive relationship ratings, and overall well-being. However, their defensive psychological structure prevents them from accessing these healthier patterns. They remain trapped in cycles where their attempts to control others ultimately create the very isolation and insecurity they're trying to avoid. As one researcher noted, we all get scared sometimes, and so we all get into power dynamics sometimes. The difference is that most people can eventually learn to exit the power dynamics and show up authentically, leading to deeper connection and more harmonious relationships. For those with deeply entrenched authoritarian patterns, this authentic showing up feels impossibly threatening, keeping them locked in destructive cycles of domination that ultimately satisfy no one, least of all themselves. So then, how do we help them, and therefore ourselves, without becoming like them? Healing ourselves and them, a compassionate path forward without becoming what we oppose. The question of how to help those with authoritarian and narcissistic tendencies while protecting ourselves represents one of the most profound challenges of our time. The answer lies not in abandoning them to their destructive patterns, but in understanding that their healing is intrinsically connected to our collective well-being, and that this work requires us to embody the very principles we wish to see flourish. Understanding the therapeutic landscape, the complexity of narcissistic healing. Traditional therapeutic approaches to narcissistic personality disorder face significant challenges. Research shows that individuals with severe emotional deficits may be self-aware and knowledgeable about narcissistic personality disorder, but this awareness alone does not lead to healing, merely to behavioral modification. This suggests that surface-level interventions are insufficient for creating genuine transformation. However, deeper therapeutic modalities show promise. Subconscious energy healing therapy SET provides a complementary treatment by accessing and reprogramming unconscious patterns, offering a holistic approach to transforming deep-seated deceptive behaviors into authentic communication. The key insight from self-psychology models is that narcissistic psychopathology results from parental lack of empathy. During development, meaning the therapeutic relationship must provide the empathic mirroring that was missing in childhood. The vulnerability paradox. Perhaps most importantly, research reveals that the key to healing narcissistic personality disorder is actually embracing vulnerability. This means accepting failure, accepting that it's okay to be human, and living in reality rather than the fantasy of the false perfect self. One recovery insight notes that NPD is healed when you stop feeding the ego machine and start to live as the lesser being, also known as the true self you hide. Compassionate boundaries, protection without persecution, understanding boundary dynamics with narcissists. Setting boundaries with narcissistic individuals requires a fundamentally different approach than traditional boundary setting. Research shows that narcissists have difficulty with boundaries due to their arrogance, entitlement, impulsivity, poor self-reflective capacity, lack of empathy, and grandiosity. They believe rules don't apply to them and want to do what they want without consequences. The most effective boundaries with narcissistic individuals are often unspoken actions rather than verbal declarations. Instead of announcing boundaries, the focus shifts to personal actions that protect your emotional and psychological safety. This approach recognizes that telling narcissists about your boundaries often becomes ammunition for manipulation, rather than respect for your limits. Emotional boundaries, the core defense. Emotional boundaries are particularly crucial because narcissists cannot tolerate shame and seek to offload it to others as quickly as possible. Their core psychological issue involves passing along guilt and shame to avoid their own feelings of inadequacy. Understanding this pattern helps in developing emotional boundaries that block incoming emotions of guilt and shame while maintaining your own emotional integrity. Research emphasizes that the boundary becomes something you set for yourself, rather than waiting for them to honor external requests. This might involve limiting what you share emotionally, going gray rock by minimizing engagement, and not taking their manipulation tactics personally. Collective healing approaches. Community-based trauma recovery. The most promising approaches to healing authoritarian and narcissistic patterns involve community-based interventions that address collective trauma. Community-based healing combines personal relationships with professional resources, building strong connections that promote empathy, open communication, and shared experiences. Research on collective healing shows that trauma recovery is most effective when it occurs in relational fields of safety, presence, and witnessing. As one expert notes, collective trauma requires collective healing. We can't do it alone. This approach recognizes that individual narcissistic patterns often stem from broader cultural and familial trauma that requires systemic healing. Restorative justice models. Restorative justice offers a powerful framework for addressing harm without perpetuating cycles of abuse. The approach emphasizes recovery and atonement, focusing on restoration rather than retribution. Research shows that restorative justice practices have positive psychological impacts on victims, including reduced post-traumatic symptomatology and improved emotional regulation. Studies demonstrate that restorative justice leads to decreased negative emotions like anger, fear, and sadness, while developing more positive and empathic perceptions toward offenders. 11. Critically, 95% of victims in restorative justice processes reported that their needs for security, information, expression, and validation were met, with effects persisting over 5 years. 11. Communalization of trauma. Communalization of trauma (COT) represents an innovative approach that promotes recovery by restoring safety, trust, and connection to community. This method recognizes that trauma narratives are healing only when shared with a trustworthy community that establishes safety, validates experiences, and provides diverse alternative perspectives. COT approaches have shown success with various traumatized populations by giving voice to experiences that are often ignored or marginalized. The key functions include establishing safety and trust, validating feelings and experiences, connecting emotionally with survivors, and challenging negative views resulting from trauma. Systemic change without becoming the problem. Addressing power structures therapeutically. Research on power dynamics in relationships reveals that understanding and addressing power imbalances is crucial for preventing the reproduction of authoritarian patterns. Systemic therapists need appropriate depth of understanding regarding power dynamics to recognize their manifestations and intervene appropriately. The challenge lies in working for systemic change while maintaining the relational and collaborative principles we seek to embody. Studies show that grassroots activism can challenge power structures and drive change while advocating for systemic transformation and community resilience. The key is developing approaches that move from tactical interventions to strategic levels of enduring impact, historical trauma, and collective healing. Understanding historical trauma provides insight into how collective patterns of domination perpetuate across generations. Research shows that there are individual and societal consequences of long-ago collective trauma that require specific interventions. Countries that have addressed historical trauma through memorial visits, socio-therapeutic interventions, and truth and reconciliation processes show improved social cohesion and reduced intergenerational trauma. In Rwanda, large-scale socio-therapeutic interventions after genocide involved groups of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders meeting to discuss safety, trust, care, respect, and memory without direct confrontation about atrocities. These interventions, lasting at least 15 weeks, were positively evaluated and continued to show benefits. Practical implementation strategies, individual-level interventions, self-care, and trauma work before engaging with narcissistic individuals. It's essential to address your own trauma history and develop strong emotional regulation skills. Therapy for childhood trauma can help identify triggers, develop coping strategies, and decrease symptoms in a safe, supportive environment. Boundary development, practice boundary setting in safer relationships first, gradually building skills before applying them to more challenging situations. Remember that people who use abusive tactics will respond defensively, so prepare for escalation when implementing boundaries. Understanding manipulation. Learning to recognize manipulation tactics helps protect against emotional exploitation. This includes understanding that everyone who talks to you wants something, distinguishing between negotiation and manipulation, and being aware of intimidation, lies, blame, and omission as manipulation forms. Community-level interventions. Support networks. Developing strong support systems is crucial for both healing narcissistic individuals and protecting their targets. Support groups provide trauma survivors with environments where they can openly share experiences and coping strategies. Educational approaches. Community education about narcissism, trauma, and healthy relationships helps create cultural awareness that prevents the normalization of abusive patterns. 8. This includes teaching children about healthy boundaries and supporting friends in difficult relationships. Restorative practices. Implementing restorative justice principles in community conflicts can help address harm while promoting accountability and healing. This approach emphasizes restoration over retribution and focuses on victim recovery, building understanding, and fostering responsibility in perpetrators. Systemic-level interventions. Institutional reform. Working to reform institutions that enable authoritarian behavior requires understanding how power structures operate and developing strategies that don't reproduce the same patterns. Pro-democracy approaches must be consistent, coherent, and designed to anticipate authoritarian efforts to subvert reform processes. Prevention programs. Developing programs that address the root causes of authoritarian personality development, including childhood trauma, inadequate attachment, and exposure to authoritarian values. Research shows that exposure to authoritarian values leads to lower positive affect and higher negative affect, emphasizing the importance of promoting egalitarian values. Cultural healing. Addressing collective trauma requires acknowledging and processing the deeply rooted wounds of colonialism, genocide, slavery, patriarchy, and other forms of systemic violence. This involves creating space for grieving, restoration, and reconciliation rather than repressing collective pain. The path forward, integration, and hope. The ultimate goal is not to abandon those trapped in narcissistic and authoritarian patterns, but to create conditions where their healing becomes possible. while protecting ourselves and our communities from harm. This requires holding two truths simultaneously: that these individuals are responsible for their actions and choices, and that their patterns often stem from their own unhealed trauma. Research shows that narcissistic traits can be addressed through specific therapeutic interventions, particularly those that focus on developing empathy and authentic self-compassion. However, this healing must occur within frameworks that prioritize the safety and well-being of their targets while maintaining hope for transformation. The holographic cosmogram's principle of interconnectedness reminds us that individual healing and collective healing are inseparable. When we embody the collaborative, egalitarian principles we wish to see in the world, while maintaining strong boundaries and refusing to enable destructive behavior, we create the conditions where genuine transformation becomes possible. This work requires extraordinary patience, wisdom, and community support. It means refusing to meet harm with harm while also refusing to enable continued abuse. It means holding space for the possibility of healing while accepting that some individuals may never choose the vulnerability required for authentic change. Most importantly, it means recognizing that our own healing and growth are essential components of any larger transformation we seek to create in the world. Through this approach, we can work toward a future where authoritarian and narcissistic patterns are no longer normalized or rewarded, where trauma is healed rather than passed down through generations, and where the genuine collaboration and mutual respect embodied in the Cosmogram's sacred geometry becomes the foundation for human relationships and social structures. Finally, what do we do with our desire for vengeance? What do we do with our desire for vengeance? The holographic cosmogram you provided is a visual and philosophical system that emphasizes interconnectedness, balance, recursion, and the unity of opposites. Embodied in concepts like Ubuntu, I am because we are, equality, and the cyclical movement of the spiral returning to its source. This framework suggests that every action, including vengeance, reverberates through the whole and ultimately returns to us. Understanding the desire for vengeance. Vengeance is a deeply human response to being wronged. Neuroscientific and psychological research shows that the urge for revenge activates the brain's reward circuitry, making it feel momentarily satisfying. However, this satisfaction is fleeting and often gives way to rumination, bitterness, and a cycle of ongoing pain. The Cosmogram's principle of recursion, what goes out returns, reminds us that vengeance perpetuates harm, both to others and to ourselves. The ethical challenge, breaking the cycle. Vengeance and trauma, seeking revenge rarely resolves the original hurt. Instead, it often passes trauma forward, continuing cycles of conflict and pain. Forgiveness as liberation. Forgiveness, by contrast, is not about condoning wrongdoing, but about freeing ourselves from the emotional prison of resentment. It is a conscious act that interrupts the cycle of harm and allows healing to begin. Responsibility for our response. The Cosmogram's emphasis on wholeness and equality calls us to take responsibility for how we respond to harm, choosing actions that restore balance rather than deepen division. Practical steps for transforming vengeance. Acknowledge your emotions, recognize and honor your anger and pain. Suppressing these feelings only strengthens their hold. Reflect on the bigger pattern. The Cosmogram teaches that every part is connected to the whole. Ask yourself, what kind of world do I help create by acting on vengeance? What legacy do I want to leave in the web of relationships? Practice empathy and perspective-taking. Try to understand what led the other person to harm you. This does not excuse their actions, but it can soften the grip of anger and open the door to compassion. 4. Set healthy boundaries. Forgiveness does not mean allowing continued harm. Protect yourself and clarify what is acceptable moving forward. Release the need for revenge. Remind yourself that holding on to vengeance keeps you chained to the past and to the person who hurt you. Letting go is an act of self-liberation. 3. 6. Engage in mindfulness or spiritual practice. Techniques like meditation, journaling, or prayer can help you process pain and cultivate peace. Seek restorative justice where possible, if appropriate. Pursue dialogue and accountability that aim to repair harm rather than perpetuate cycles of retribution. The Cosmogram's wisdom, returning to wholeness. The spiral in the Cosmogram emerges from and returns to 4, the number of wholeness, balance, and the foundation of all. When we are wronged, the desire for vengeance pulls us away from this center. But by choosing forgiveness, empathy, and responsibility, we return to wholeness, restoring not only ourselves but the fabric of the community. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Forgiveness is not forgetting or excusing. It is a radical act of reclaiming your own peace, breaking the cycle of harm, and living in alignment with the interconnected, balanced universe the Cosmogram reveals. In summary, transform your desire for vengeance by honoring your pain, understanding the cycle of harm, practicing forgiveness, and returning to the center of wholeness and connection. In doing so, you heal yourself, and, by extension, the world.